Can the New Orleans Saints stop Jalen Hurts?
And can the Philadelphia Eagles stop anyone?
You are Locked On NFL Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome into this Crossover Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles and Locked On Saints. We appreciate you very much for being here with us. We are your hosts today, Gino Camilleri from over at Locked On Eagles, myself, Ross Jackson, over at Locked On Saints, here to break down this big time matchup. We're going to break down, taking a look at what each of these teams needs to do to get a win, how it is that they present a unique challenge for one another. We'll take a look at the Saints' perspective in terms of trying to contain Jalen Hurts, while we take a look at the Eagles' perspective of trying to contain, well, just about anybody. It's going to be a big test for both of these teams. So we're going to be breaking it all down here. We appreciate you very much for making us your first listener, for being an everydayer on Locked On Eagles or Locked On Saints, both a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode, this Crossover Thursday, as well as all of our Crossover Thursdays across the NFL or across the Locked On Podcast Network, brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL to get $50 instantly when you play $5. Gino, Philadelphia Eagles coming to town here to the Bayou to take on the New Orleans Saints on Sunday. Let's kick things off with what I take to be the biggest question around the Philadelphia Eagles right now, and it centers around the defense.
This is one of those things that if you look back a couple years ago, Ross, there was a game that happened in the Superdome between the Philadelphia Eagles and the New Orleans Saints, and the Saints won by a few points, and I remember Malcolm Jenkins pointing in gesture towards the sideline in that game. And the feeling coming out of Philadelphia is, can you stop a New Orleans Saints team who has scored a point on every single offensive drive that they have had? And the Philadelphia Eagles defense right now can't stop the run. The secondary has been better. But if you can't stop the run and you're allowing over 300 yards in the first 2 weeks, and now Alvin Kamara is the guy that you have to stop, the Philadelphia Eagles have to find a way to stop sinking this ship before it goes down with the Titanic.
Yeah, it was Alvin Kamara, of course, who caught that infamous for Philly fans touchdown that led to that gesture from Malcolm Jenkins to Sean Payton. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like it's a huge concern. Kind of flips on the other side here in terms of what it is that we expect or expected from the Philadelphia Eagles, that invested so much on the defensive side, that still has Vic Fangio, one of, if not the best defensive mind in the NFL. So there's obviously still some opportunity there for this team to get better on that side of the football. But I assume the New Orleans Saints are going to present a pretty unique challenge there, being a team that has rushed for over 300, or exactly, sorry, not for over, but has rushed for 370 yards in their first two games.
And I think that's the exact type of game plan that the Saints are going to want to attack the Eagles defense with. And if you look at what Atlanta did and what Green Bay tried to do, it all kind of stems from having one of the better running backs in the league, allowing your offense to play ahead of the sticks, which then puts the Eagles defense in this situation where they're not great at defending play action. They're not great at defending the run. And now you have to worry about arguably one of the best deep threats in the league in Rashid Shaheed coming to town. And that's one of the things I don't think the Eagles have faced, is that downfield explosive element. So if you can't stop things underneath in this cover six world with Vic Fangio against the run, it's going to allow Derek Carr to open things up deep. But good thing is Quinyon Mitchell and Darius Slay have been two of the better players for this team. It seems like the Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, invest in him, let him go, bring him back for a lower cost, seems to work. And hey, a familiar face in New Orleans, Zach Bond is turning into quite the football player in Philadelphia.
Yeah, a couple of revenge games on the way between those two guys. I want Saints fans to remember, too, that the 70-yard one-play scoring touchdown last week against the Dallas Cowboys was against the cover six. You're going to see a lot of that when it comes to this Philadelphia Eagles Vic Fangio defense. Doesn't mean that they're going to have the perfect play called every time, but definitely something the New Orleans Saints have found some success against. We'll see if that continues with Rashid Shaheed. Real quick, before we flip over to the offensive side, Gino, I got to know, like, is everyone pumped for the revenge game opportunity here between when it comes to Gardner Johnson and Bond, or is the expectation a little bit different around that?
Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is a one-of-one getting under your skin type of guy, and I'm
100%.
sure he cannot wait to come back to the Superdome. I'm sure the fans are going to try to embrace him, but I'm sure he's going to make up some story to get under the fan's skin just to give himself that edge. And he's that type of player, though. If you look at one of the biggest plays for the Eagles last week, it was him coming downhill, filling the gap, stopping Bijan Robinson on a big fourth down. I think New Orleans Saints fans know exactly what this guy brings. He brings the juice. And in that building, when it's going to be so loud, you're going to have to find a way to subdue them one way or another. I think CGJ is going to try and make a big play. And he hasn't been able to take the ball away from a fumble or an interception perspective. And that was his calling card a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Eagles need to get back to that if they want to stop this team. I can't even believe I'm saying it out loud, Ross, that they have scored on every offensive drive. We're not talking about like Tom Brady here. We're talking about Derek Carr and the Saints, man. This is impressive.
Hard to tell the difference right now, man. Very hard to tell the difference. Derek Carr's name is up there in all those lists and places where we maybe never thought we would see Derek Carr's name, but yet here we are at the beginning of the season. Very glad that they picked up that flag for CJ2 after that great stop that you were talking about, because that there was a reason for that. All right, let's flip over to the offensive side. Biggest story for the Philadelphia Eagles offense. What are you looking for there?
We know Devontae Smith. We know Saquon Barkley. But the guy who had the most targets outside of those two was Britton Covey last week.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Saints fans are like, who on earth is Britton Covey? And that's exactly how Britton Covey should be used for the Eagles. He's our punt return extraordinaire, but he was used in this offense way more than they needed him to. They acquired Jahan Dotson. They still have Dallas Goedert in the building, but Dallas Goedert only had 2 targets until the final drive in the fourth quarter. That has to change. Jahan Dotson had a lone touch in the first quarter. That has to change. A.J. Brown more than likely won't be playing in this game yet again. We know the star that Saquon is. We know who Devontae Smith is. But Kellen Moore, how can you start to spread the ball around? Because one of the things that helped the Eagles get to 34 points in week 1 against Green Bay was that they were able to distribute it to those playmakers outside of the big three. Because just like a basketball team, we always say on our show, you got to find your Jamal Crawford, that 6 man that can hit the corner three.
Yeah.
The Eagles did not have that last week.
Yeah, that's big. And I will say you might find some Saints fans that know who Britton Covey is. There's a lot of BYU fans that are Saints fans. So they're probably familiar through the Utah. Oh yeah, they're probably familiar through the Utah connection there and everything.
He's a gamer, man. He's a short king too, about my size, 5'8". So I root for him through and through. But this is the NFL. I don't know if we want to be targeting him too much next week.
Yeah, well, hey, at least you'd rather the short king at wide receiver than at quarterback if you're the Carolina Panthers. So look over the offensive side as well. You know, the Philadelphia Eagles, interestingly, going through like a similar evolution on the offensive side to New Orleans. How's that been working out so far?
Motion is the lotion, as all my friends from Damon College Physical Therapy would say way back in the day. It really is. It's the one thing that can just make your offense go without having to win every single one-on-one matchup. And that's what really killed them in 2023, was that they put these 2 guys out there, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, said, hey, you guys are good enough, go win your one-on-ones. But everybody else, they couldn't quite do that. But now with Kellen Moore, a reason why you can target Britton Covey so much is because you're scheming him open. You're getting him into space, taking and utilizing this cover 6 heavy world where teams are playing zone. We have to understand pacing, timing, space, and that's what the Eagles offense really has been under Kellen Moore. Jalen Hurts has a lot more autonomy at the line of scrimmage to call out blitz, to recognize where some of that space is. And I think it's been a benefit to him. He's been much better against the blitz in this season, and I think a lot has to do with Kellen Moore giving some answers to the test that maybe he didn't have last year.
That's excellent. Now, that's a fantastic point to look at as we turn things over to the New Orleans Saints side, because the Saints play a very different style of defense. And I'm curious, Gino, of how the Saints' man-heavy approach, press man-heavy approach, is going to impact Kellen Moore's approach on offense. Let's break that down next as we continue on with this fantastic crossover Thursday edition, Locked On Eagles and Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Crossover Thursday, Locked On Eagles and Locked On Saints, is presented by our friends over at Arena Club. I'm just now getting into collecting collectible cards like player cards and things like that. And listen, the idea of spending a couple grand on a Patrick Mahomes rookie card, for instance, is, well, let's just say out of the cards for me. And that's why I love Arena Club and the Arena Club Slab Pack, which is the only repack that provides real value, a complete view of the possible cards, and a clear hit rate for each one. Whether you're buying, selling, trading, or displaying, Arena Club is the card collecting platform that you must go and check out right now. You can get 10% off of your first slab pack or first card purchase by going to arenaclub.com/lockedonnfl and using promo code LOCKEDONNFL. That's arenaclub.com/lockedonnfl, code LOCKEDONNFL to get 10% off your first purchase. Again, arenaclub.com/lockedonnfl, promo code LOCKEDONNFL. All right, everybody, continuing on with this Crossover Thursday edition. Gino Camilleri of Locked On Eagles, myself, Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints, here to break down what is probably going to be a pretty high-scoring matchup. I will say the FanDuel has this game at an over-under of 49.5 points. It's the second highest win total or points total in all of week 3. So this one should be a lot of fun. And part of what's going to make this one fun, Gino, is the way that both of these defenses approach things very differently. And then the offenses that are kind of both making these adjustments. You were just mentioning about the motion being the lotion, as you will, in the Eagles offense and how that works against the zone coverages. I'm curious, looking at New Orleans, who I think their biggest task is going to be stopping Jalen Hurts. That's going to be their biggest thing, is can they make plays at the quarterback? Can they not let him go out there and run for a bunch of yards and extend plays and stuff like that? And that's going to be a little bit challenging because the Saints defenders are all going to turn their backs to Jalen Hurts as they're defending, because they are a press man-heavy system. Of course, they run some zone, but you know how it goes, man-heavy system. And I'm curious about their ability to stop Jalen Hurts, but also what that man coverage does for what it is that Kellen Moore is trying to do over on the offensive side in Philly.
One of the things Kellen Moore, he's done a great job of putting his influence on what Nick Sirianni had done very well in his first couple of years, and that was the quarterback run game. And I don't know what it was in the second quarter of last week, but Jalen Hurts went from Bruce Banner to the Hulk all of a sudden, and it looked like he got his legs back underneath him, and he turned into this all-star on the ground once again. And you make a fantastic point. The big difference between zone and man is that in a man-turn situation, these defenders are turning their back away from the quarterback. Well, who is the quarterback that if you turn his back, he's going to have all this space to run? That's Jalen Hurts. That's one of the things that in week 1 against the Packers, they did a really good job in a more single high man cover situation of keeping Jalen Hurts in these short areas. They did not allow a ton of rushing yards to him. It was Atlanta that really, in this zone-based defense that they run, they were more apt to allow yards to Jalen Hurts. But I think you're going to see now a more even approach when it comes to the man element from the Saints, who have those guys that can play. There's going to be more opportunities where Jalen can run because he needs to and pick up those yards, much like last week, as opposed to just one look, put your head down and go. He has to understand that with man, things can develop for you. Because if you look at that Green Bay game, you got shots down the field. So that's the give and take. I know he wants to go and pick up those yards like last week, but in man, guys aren't having their eyes to the quarterback. They're not keeping everything underneath and rallying to the QB. All of a sudden, it takes one guy to get out of their break slowly, get into a man turn situation, and Devontae Smith is 1.5 yards stacked on top of his hip. So that's what you have to remember as well. A lot different from what they've seen the first 2 weeks, but that's the challenge of the NFL. It's a new puzzle each and every week, especially for QB1. But you're getting paid $50 million plus. It's your problem, not mine.
That's right. That's exactly right. And thank goodness, because I don't want to have to deal with it.
No.
But the other part too, that's like very different that New Orleans does that maybe Green Bay and Atlanta didn't bring to the table, was that New Orleans blitzes almost 25% of the time over on the defensive side. So you mentioned how strong Jalen Hurts has been against the blitz at the beginning of this season. So I'm curious to see if the Saints are going to kind of tempt that back a little bit. And look, they've got a guy on their defensive line now that is familiar with Jalen Hurts, that's familiar with Kellen Moore to an extent, having played in the NFC East, Chase Young. And so I'm curious how much he's whispering in the ears of Dennis Allen and, some of these other defenders saying, don't let him get outside those numbers. Like, don't let him get the sideline on you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let him do that. And so one of the biggest things that New Orleans' defense has struggled with, it almost feels like year after year after year, Gino, is when it comes to these mobile quarterbacks. And we saw a little bit of it against Bryce Young week 1 from the Saints, is that they just struggle to finish plays when they get to that quarterback. Bringing the quarterback down has been the tricky part. The Saints kind of counteracted that 2 weeks ago, by instead of relying solely on the defensive line to get that pressure, they were sending those slot blitzes. And Alontae Taylor ended up with 3 sacks in that game. I don't know if he's going to be able to replicate that here specifically, but I'd be curious to see how much that second level and secondary pressure comes from New Orleans to try to maybe contain or at least get those quick pressures on Jalen Hurts before he has the opportunity to see where that pressure is coming from.
So if this was last year, I would say you're probably going to hit home on like 3 to 4 of those blitzes off of the edge. This year, I would say at least 1 will hit home, but that's exactly where Jalen Hurts has improved, because
there you go.
In those situations, the way you identify them is to identify the overhang guy. So that means, is there somebody lined up directly behind them to fill in the space if they were to blitz? That has been one area where Jalen Hurts has been really good at identifying where those guys are vacating space. You'll see him and Devontae Smith do this little hand gesture when they want to know that we're hot off of the edge. And now having that autonomy to do that, that's going to be a nice little chess game. And like, how many times does, let's say, your safety, instead of coming down and filling, he fills in for the corner pops over into the nickel position. That's the chess match that you're going to see between these two teams. And the defensive line, I think you brought that up. This is going to be great tape to watch if you are a fan of offensive line play versus defensive line play. My goodness, I can't wait. You're talking about some of the great pass rushers in football, some of the great offensive linemen. There's going to be plays where the Eagles, it looks like you have them beat, and then all of a sudden Chase Young chasing you down on a backside run to the front side of the play, and you're going to see Lattimore making plays and all these guys. I mean, the Honey Badger. It's going to be a game of names, is what I'm saying. Like those names that are big time players.
I love that. Yeah.
I think they're going to have to step up in these games. And so Lattimore, I hate playing this guy, dude. He's so good. He's such a good man cover corner.
Philly.
No, he's so good.
I know. Yeah. So the hope is that he'll be back out there on the field. He was back at practice on Wednesday, which is a good sign. Head coach Dennis Allen, who also calls the defensive plays for New Orleans, he said that Marshall Lattimore wanted to play against Dallas, and Dennis Allen basically told him like, no, because I don't want the 1 week thing to turn into a 3 or 4 week thing.
Same
and it kind of, and he kind of said that, in different words, Marshall Lattimore was a little bit peeved by that. So we'll see, what that ends up translating to when he gets back out on the field this week against Philly, if he does. But our expectation is that he'll probably be ready to go. Looking over at the New Orleans Saints offense, which has been the big story for them so far this season, a complete rejuvenation of offense in New Orleans after 3 years, what felt like depravity over on that side. It's been offensive coordinator Klint Kubiak. It's been quarterback Derek Carr. But for me, the other thing that it's been, Gino, is the offensive line. They have been outstanding, and they've been aided a lot. Screens, play action, the easy buttons that you see in the NFL. But man, have they, when tasked to be the force in the run game, to be the force in protecting Derek Carr, they've done a good job there. And so I think that when it comes to the offensive side for New Orleans, it's all about playing the songs that they know and doing what it is that matches their identity. And that's what they're going to try to win with.
Where you guys have a clear identity on the offensive side of the ball, the Eagles don't have a defensive identity right now. It's not stopping the run. It's not getting after the quarterback. And the Eagles played Atlanta last week, who after week 1 was graded out as one of the worst pass blocking offensive lines in the sport. They had one quarterback hit on Kirk Cousins all day long. And you're talking about an offensive line that is probably a little bit better than that of Atlanta. And I don't know if the Eagles are going to be able to hit home again, because that was the hardest thing for them was rushing in unison, as edge rusher Josh Sweat said. They're not on the same page. And Derek Carr, he's got these deep threat weapons. The Eagles, if you give a guy like that 3.5 seconds where they were giving Kirk Cousins time last week, they're going to eat you alive. And then play the songs the hits are, let's play ahead of the sticks. We're going to be in second and short, third and short situations. Exactly what Atlanta did to the Eagles last week. Exactly what teams like Washington a couple years ago, when that was the Eagles' first loss when they were undefeated for the longest time. It was get short of the sticks, convert third downs, possess the ball until the cows come home. But the one thing about New Orleans is you still have to worry about the deep game. So where does the dam get put up for this defense? Because the Dome is not a place that has been kind to the Philadelphia Eagles when those waters do get a little bit too high, because, man, they can sink really quickly. And I think Lou over at our show is much more petrified of this New Orleans Saints attack than I am, because it has to come back to average at some point, like 15 out of 15. That's pretty darn good. Yeah. The Eagles hopefully can come back to average, but at the same time, if they play the songs that they want to play, like you said, Ross, they know what to do, and they put people in the stands because they play the hits.
Yeah, that's what it is. And we'll see if Philly can kind of force them off key a little bit. I'll keep the music pun going a little bit. All right, coming up next, we're going to take a look at what it is that each of these teams has to do to win. And Gino already started to touch on a big one. Can they limit the New Orleans Saints when it comes to what it is that they love to do? Can they make them uncomfortable? Gino will dig into that here in just a moment as we continue on with this crossover Thursday edition, Locked On Eagles, Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints and Locked On Eagles, this crossover Thursday, brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, the New Orleans Saints are favored in this matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles at 2.5-point favorites, or the Eagles, if you're an Eagles fan, 2.5-point underdogs. Maybe you like being the road dog in this situation as an Eagles fan, or maybe you think this game is going to be higher or lower scoring than projected 49.5-point over-under in this one, second highest across the NFL. So which way you think this game is going to go? Well, you can get in on that action over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now through September 22nd, so that clock is ticking, all FanDuel customers that put $5 down will get a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with your YouTube TV base plan, you're going to be able to watch every regular season Sunday out-of-market game. All that you need is a Google account, a current form of payment, and you can cancel any time. Visit FanDuel.com so that you can download America's #1 sportsbook. All right, y'all, it is crossover Thursday here, Locked On Eagles and Locked On Saints. That's Gino Camilleri. I'm Ross Jackson. This crossover Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles and Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at Prize Picks, as well as all of our crossover content here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL to get $50 instantly when you play $5. All right, so Gino, what is it that the Philadelphia Eagles need to do to get a win against the New Orleans Saints on Sunday?
The LOE 3 keys to victory. Number one, as I said, find a way to make that Saints offense be off key one way or another. Put them behind the sticks. They cannot be in second and short, third and short, because that's when you set up those downfield shots, which sets up their explosive offense, which allows them to put up as many points as they've had the last 2 weeks. Number two, start fast. The Eagles, they have started slower than anyone in the first 2 weeks. Their first 2 possessions in back-to-back games went interception, fumble, punt, turnover on downs. They have not scored any points on their first 2 possessions in either of those games. It would be nice to get at least a field goal there. Number 3, play 60 minutes. Not 58, not 59, 60 minutes. Because if you can allow the 7th most improbable comeback in the next-gen stats era since 2016 against Kirk Cousins on one leg, what can this New Orleans Saints team do to you?
That's big. That's big. And look, that I love your first 2 there in particular. They stand out to me because of how much they relate to one another, right? Like the New Orleans Saints in the first 2 games, as you highlighted, 15 straight possessions with their first team defense on the field, scoring points, right? And that included 6 of 6 to start against Dallas on touchdowns in AT&T Stadium. And so the Saints all of a sudden, And Gino, this has not been the case in New Orleans for the past, I'll say about 3 years. They have not been a fast start offense. They have been a late push offense as of late. And all of a sudden that has changed under offensive coordinator Klint Kubiak. Derek Carr playing at a whole nother level right now. And so, yeah, I think that like that making them play from behind the sticks, giving them those 3rd and longs, which I don't think the Saints saw a 3rd and long last week against Dallas until I believe it was the 4th quarter. And it was like a 3rd and 12. So it was a considerable 3rd and long at that point. But there's that. And then coupled with Philly's struggles early on, like there's an opportunity here for New Orleans to continue to open up an early lead, which has really propelled them over the course of the past 2 weeks. So the only team in the NFL, I believe right now, that has not trailed in a game so far through the first couple of weeks. So I think that those are huge. I love those highlights from you.
And you have to start fast, especially if it's going to be a shootout, Ross, because if you can go 6 straight possessions of getting touchdowns, even if half of them are touchdowns, half of them are field goals, you're still talking about 30 points. And that's a good offense in the NFL. And we've talked about at Locked On Eagles, 35 points should be what this Eagles offense aspires to be each and every week. They were a point off of that week 1. Last week got a little slow. But one of the things that in my mind is head scratching with the Saints, the amount of offensive touchdowns in the sport is down dramatically over the last few years. And New Orleans is still putting up an egregious amount of touchdowns. It does not make any sense.
It's such an outlier. And that's one of the reasons why we're all kind of watching and going like, okay, so when does it settle down and what does it settle down to? Because I think everyone's accepted like, okay, 3 straight games of 40 plus points. If you go back to week 18 of the 2023 season, this is abnormal. At some point, it's got to settle down to, but exactly what it settles down to could still be winning football for New Orleans. We just kind of have to see what that's going to be. So I love that. So yours is the LOE 3 over there at Locked On Eagles. I'm going to give you 3 of my Jackson 5, which is what mine are over at Locked On Saints. So we both have a lot of fun. So number 1 for me is stopping the run and making plays at the quarterback. If they don't do this, the Saints will probably end up like very close to, if not losing this game. Like this is the spoiler for New Orleans, is if they don't do that. That's why that's number 1 to me. I have a lot of faith in New Orleans. I picked New Orleans for this game, all that kind of stuff. I think that they're like on a roll and it's going to continue here. But that's the big key for me in terms of what can decimate New Orleans' hopes of going 3-0 for this one. Number 2 for me is keeping and playing to their offensive identity, as we were just discussing. There's no need to complicate things here. Just do the things that work. They line up in a lot of 12 personnel. They love their 2 tight ends. They use a lot of 21 as well, which would be 2 running backs, and they dabble, I'll say, in 3 wide receiver sets. But for the most part, what they want to do is run the football, win with their offensive line in the trenches, give help to their offensive line with their very multiple tight ends, multiple in that they can do a lot of different things. I'll say versatile tight ends is probably more appropriate. And then, as you mentioned before, threaten deep with 2 sub-4-4 guys. That's what they want to do as an offense. That's what they'll need to do as an offense. And then finally, I think number 3 for me is stealing a possession or a score. That could be a special teams touchdown. That could be a defense, creating some turnovers, things like that. I think that will allow you to get off to a fast start.
One thing I said on the crossover last week to host Aaron Freeman is that with those 2 veteran safeties they have there in Atlanta, those guys that love to play with their eyes to the quarterback and almost like this poacher hunter type of role, the Eagles got 2 guys this week that you're going to have to worry about as well. The Saints have some good safeties. So if you want some opportunities to make plays on the football, Jalen Hurts has been better in the last week throwing the ball, but he still has some balls where you're like, oh, the defender could make a play on that if your wide receiver didn't play cornerback for a second. But it is not great in Philadelphia right now, but I think it goes back to your first point. You have to make plays on Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts, because what they did last week, if you look at that 3rd down drop and you look at the interception to Jalen Hurts in a vacuum, yes, it's rough. But to get them to that point where they almost won that football game after a 17-play, 70-yard, 9.5-minute drive to basically grind that game out, it came on the back of Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts. Even as badly as their coaches coached, sometimes talent is what you need in the NFL. Yeah. I think this one is going to be close. Like you said, I think the average has to come back down to the middle some point for the Saints. but I think that one big explosive touchdown could be the difference. Like Shaheed can cook, man. He might be the best in the league right now doing that.
Gino, I think you and I both preach that because I'm sure I've heard you say this before over in Locked On Eagles, but the game in the NFL, particularly against two good teams, comes down to one or two plays.
Oh, it always
makes
does.
a difference, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's exactly what we end up seeing in this matchup for sure. And it's going to be an exciting one, man. I can't wait for this one. It's going to be a blast.
Two teams with good offensive lines. It comes down to the trenches. They can run the ball. Running the football is back in the National Football League, and I really think it comes down to controlling time of possession, who takes care of the ball. And we're talking about 1930s football here in the year 2024. It's beautiful.
I love it. I absolutely love it. All right, y'all. Well, if you want to keep up with more of what's going on around the Eagles and around the Saints, make sure you're tuning in to Locked On Eagles and Locked On Saints every day. No fluff, nothing else, just Eagles talk with Locked On Eagles, Saints talk with Locked On Saints. We both have Friday episodes with kind of a final preview going into this game. And if you want more NFL content, don't forget, as you made us your first listen, to make your second listen Locked On NFL. You got Tony Rowland over there giving you that double shot of daily espresso of NFL talk in the morning, and then Tony Wiggins in the barbershop wrapping it up for you later on in the afternoon. For Gino Camilleri, I am Ross Jackson. We appreciate you so much for making us your first listen, for making us a part of your day and a part of your routine, and being here with us today on Locked On Eagles and Locked On Saints, proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.